In December 2013, a sign came down in Brentwood, Tennessee. It didn't happen with a press conference. There was no farewell ceremony, no crowd gathered in the parking lot. A crew showed up, did the work, and drove away. 50 years of identity removed in an afternoon, not because the company had failed, not because the products had stopped selling, not because a foreign competitor had undercut them into the ground. It happened because a craft store chain in Oklahoma City had become too famous. At its peak, the Hobby Lobby International catalog arrived in American mailboxes like a seasonal event. Hundreds of pages, thousands of products, electric motors, glider kits, balsa wood, and servo wire, and the particular smell of a package that had traveled across the country just to land on your doorstep. For a generation of American men who built things with their hands and flew them with their hearts, that catalog was not a piece of junk mail. It was a promise. The electric RC revolution in the United States did not come from a corporate lab. It did not come from a defense contractor or a university research program. It came from a 600-square-foot store on Franklin Road in Nashville, Tennessee, run by a former Air Force pilot who made $15 profit his first year and didn't take a salary for 5. How does a company like that get erased? How does 50 years of catalog history, of electric flight evangelism, of a design called the Telemaster that taught a generation of Americans how to fly, how does all of that simply disappear without a single bankruptcy filing? The answer is one of the strangest stories the American hobby industry has ever produced. Jim Martin had not planned to change American aviation culture. In the early 1960s, he was just a man trying to find steady work. He had flown refueling tankers for the United States Air Force. Long missions, precise work, the kind of flying that required patience and a feel for how machines behaved under pressure. When his service ended, a recession was waiting for him on the other side. Jobs were scarce. Martin found himself living with his in-laws in Nashville, Tennessee, which is not the position any man wants to be in, and not the circumstance from which most American business empires are built. His father-in-law ran a chain of 5 and dime stores. Martin borrowed enough money to open one of his own on Franklin Road, a modest operation, the kind of store that sold everything and made nobody rich. It paid the bills. It was, by his own account, awfully boring. So, in 1964, he opened something else. Directly across the street from the dime store, in a space of roughly 600 square feet, the size of a modest living room, Jim Martin opened a radio control hobby shop. He called it Hobby Lobby, a name that came naturally from the store's original location in the lobby of his father-in-law's 5 and dime. The name was practical. The ambition behind it was anything but. That first year, Hobby Lobby took in $22,000 in revenue. After expenses, the profit was $15. 15? Martin did not take a single dollar of salary out of the business for the next 5 years. He went home every night to the knowledge that what he was building had not yet proven it deserved to exist, and he went back every morning anyway. Most men would have closed the store. Martin kept the dime store running alongside it, using one to subsidize the other, selling household goods to fund a dream that most of Nashville probably considered an eccentric sideshow. Then a Kmart opened down the street. The dime store, now outgunned and outpriced, closed. The choice had been made for him. Hobby Lobby was all he had left, and all he intended to keep. What Martin was selling in those early years was the RC hobby as it existed in the mid-1960s. Glow-plug engines, balsa construction kits, basic radio equipment that required real skill and real patience to operate. The market was small. The customers were dedicated. These were men who spent weekends at flying fields and weeknights at workbenches, who understood that the satisfaction of the hobby was inseparable from the labor it demanded. You did not simply buy an RC airplane, you built one. You learned it, you flew it, crashed it, repaired it, and flew it again. Martin understood these men because he was one of them. The pilot's instinct, the feel for how a machine moves through air, the patience required to trim a plane until it flies true, was in his hands as much as it was in any cockpit he had ever occupied. Hobby Lobby was not a retail calculation. It was an extension of who he was. By the late 1960s, the store had outlasted the dime store, outlasted the recession, and outlasted the doubts of everyone who had watched Martin pour 5 years of unpaid labor into a 600-square-foot room. The parking lot on Franklin Road was getting busier. The orders were starting to come from outside Nashville. Something was growing here. slowly on its own terms, the way things built by single-minded people tend to grow. And then Jim Martin went to Europe, and everything changed. What Martin saw in Europe in 1967 stopped him cold. While American hobbyists were still coaxing glow-plug engines to life on cold mornings, spilling fuel on their hands and pulling starters until their arms ached, European RC clubs had begun experimenting with something quieter, cleaner. An electric motor drawing power from a battery pack, spinning a propeller without combustion, without noise, without the particular temperament of a two-stroke engine that might cooperate on Tuesday and refuse to run on Saturday. The technology was primitive by any later standard. The power was anemic, the batteries heavy, the flight times short. But Martin saw past all of that. He saw what it could become. He came home to Nashville with a conviction that the American RC hobby was about to move in a direction nobody here had yet recognized, and he intended to be the one waiting when it arrived. The Hobby Lobby catalog began to change. Electric power plants appeared alongside the glow engines, gliders, aircraft that needed no engine at all, that soared on thermals and rewarded a pilot's feel for air, became a specialty. Martin built relationships with European manufacturers who were years ahead of the American market. He imported products that American hobbyists could not find anywhere else, from any other source, at any price. If you wanted to fly electric in the United States in the 1970s, there was essentially one catalog you called, one address you mailed your check to, one company that understood what you were trying to do. In 1970, Martin built a permanent home for the operation. He purchased farmland in Brentwood, Tennessee, cheap land on the edge of what was then a quiet community south of Nashville, and constructed a dedicated building. It was a real facility now, not a storefront, not a room in a strip mall, a place built specifically for the purpose of putting RC products into the hands of American hobbyists, from one end of the country to the other. The catalog that came out of that building was something that a generation of American men remember with a specificity that most commercial publications never achieve. It arrived in the mailbox, and it did not go into the recycling pile. It went to the workbench, or the kitchen table, or the recliner in the living room. Pages got dog-eared. Items got circled in pen. Wish lists got made and revised and made again. For hobbyists in rural areas, men who had no local hobby shop within 50 miles, who relied entirely on mail order to access the products they needed, the Hobby Lobby catalog was not a convenience. It was a lifeline. Then came the Telemaster. In 1973, Martin began importing a kit produced by a German manufacturer named Engel, a high-wing trainer design, with a wide, stable wing and a character that forgave the mistakes of new pilots while still rewarding the skill of experienced ones. The Telemaster, as it was called, was not the flashiest aircraft in the catalog. It was not the fastest or the most aerobatic, but it flew the way a good trainer is supposed to fly, slowly, predictably, with a gentleness that gave nervous hands time to respond, throttle it back at altitude, apply a touch of rudder trim, and the airplane would simply circle overhead, patient and steady, waiting for its pilot to catch up. By 1975, Martin had acquired the rights to the Telemaster design outright. He brought in designer Joe Brady to rework and refine it for American production. What emerged was a family of aircraft, the Junior, the Standard, the Senior, eventually the Giant with its 12-foot wingspan, that became the backbone of Hobby Lobby's identity, and, for thousands of American pilots, the aircraft on which they learned to fly. Men who are in their 60s today learned on a Telemaster. They remember the smell of the balsa sheeting coming out of the box, the weight of the hardware bag, the particular satisfaction of a wing rib slipping into its notch with exactly the right amount of resistance. They remember their first solo flight, the moment they realized the plane was flying, and they were flying it, and that these were not separate things. A significant number of those men owe that memory, at least in part, to a catalog that came out of a building in Brentwood, Tennessee. By the 1980s, the operation that Jim Martin had built from a $15 profit and 5 years of unpaid labor had become something that the American RC hobby could not easily imagine functioning without. The catalog ran to hundreds of pages. The product line covered electric motors, gliders, trainers, scale aircraft, hardware, electronics, and accessories sourced from manufacturers across Europe and the United States. Hobby Lobby International was not the largest hobby retailer in America. Tower Hobbies up in Champaign, Illinois, had that distinction. But in the specific world of electric flight and sailplanes, there was no serious competitor. Martin had found the territory that suited him, and he had built a fence around it that no one else could easily cross. The Brentwood building hummed with the particular rhythm of a catalog operation at its peak. Orders came in by mail, then by phone, eventually by fax. Product moved out in boxes wrapped and addressed and stacked for the daily pickup. The people who worked there knew the catalog the way mechanics know an engine, by feel, by sound, by the specific location of every part. They answered questions from hobbyists who called from Montana and Florida and Maine, men who had no one else to call, and they answered them with the authority of people who actually flew the products they sold. None of them knew it yet, but the most dangerous moment in the company's history had nothing to do with a competitor. It was already walking through the front door every morning, wearing a familiar face. David Martin had grown up inside Hobby Lobby the way some sons grow up inside a family farm, not as a visitor, but as someone for whom the place was simply part of the atmosphere of childhood. His father's obsession with flight, with electric power, with the catalog and the customers and the Brentwood building had been the backdrop of his entire life. When David joined the company as an adult, the assumption, unspoken but understood by everyone who knew the Martins, was that the succession was settled. Jim had built it. David would carry it. It did not work out that way. The details of David Martin's departure from Hobby Lobby International are not part of the public record. What is known is the outcome. David left, and where he went made the wound considerably sharper. He did not leave the hobby industry. He went to SIG Manufacturing, one of Hobby Lobby's direct competitors in the RC kit market, a company that had been selling balsa aircraft kits out of Montezuma, Iowa since 1951. The son trained inside his father's catalog operation was now working for the other side of the catalog. Whatever the reasons, whatever the conversations that preceded it, the practical consequence was this. Jim Martin, now moving through his 60s, was running a company he had built entirely around his own vision, his own relationships, his own instincts, and there was no longer anyone in the building who was going to carry that vision forward when he was done. A business built on the founder's passion is only as durable as the founder's ability to transfer that passion. Jim Martin had not found a way to do that. The catalog kept going out. The orders kept coming in. But somewhere in the structure of Hobby Lobby International, a load-bearing wall had quietly been removed. Meanwhile, the world outside the Brentwood building was accelerating in directions that the catalog model had not been designed to handle. The internet arrived not as a single disruption, but as a slow tide. Through the mid-1990s, mail orders still made sense. Customers who wanted specialty RC products had no better option than to find a catalog, find a phone number, and place an order. Hobby Lobby's model: deep product knowledge, specialist inventory, a publication that arrived in your home and stayed there for months, was built for exactly that world. But as the decade turned, something shifted. Online retailers began offering the same products with faster delivery and lower overhead. Pricey comparison, once impossible across catalogs that arrived on different schedules from different companies, became instantaneous. The structural advantage that mail-order specialty retailers had maintained for 30 years began to erode. Horizon Hobby, based in Champaign, Illinois, was watching all of this and moving quickly. In 2000, the company introduced the Hobby Zone Firebird, the first teach-yourself-to-fly RC airplane sold as a complete package, radio included, battery included, charger included. You opened the box and you flew the same day. No kit to build, no balsa to sand, no engine to tune, no catalog to study. The Firebird was aimed directly at the customer who had always been slightly intimidated by the hobby, the man who wanted to fly but had never wanted to learn to build. It sold extremely well. The ARF, almost ready to fly, format was not new in 2000, but the Firebird demonstrated something the industry had not fully absorbed. There was a mass market for RC aviation that had nothing to do with the traditions that companies like Hobby Lobby had been built to serve. The customer who bought a Firebird was not going to spend a winter building a Telemaster from a balsa kit. He was not going to circle items in a catalog with a red pen. He wanted to be in the air by Saturday afternoon, and the industry that served him looked nothing like the industry Jim Martin had built. This was not a temporary adjustment. It was a generational shift in what the hobby meant and who it was for. Inside Hobby Lobby International, the response was measured, perhaps too measured. The catalog continued, the electric flight specialty continued, the Telemaster continued. These were the things that had made the company what it was, and there was institutional logic in defending them. But the customers who had grown up on the catalog were aging. The next generation of hobbyists was being captured before it ever reached the mailbox. By the early 2000s, Hobby Lobby International was still a functioning, respected operation. It was not in crisis in any visible sense. The lights were on in Brentwood. The orders were being filled. But Jim Martin was in his 60s. There was no succession plan. The catalog model was bleeding quietly, and the hobby landscape his company had helped to create was now being reshaped by forces that specialized catalogs were poorly positioned to fight. He had spent 40 years building something that no one else could have built the same way. The problem, by 2003, was that no one else was going to build it at all. In 2003, Jim Martin did what founders of his generation eventually do when the succession plan fails and the years begin to accumulate. He sold. The buyer was GenCap America, a private equity firm. The transaction was clean, at least on paper. Martin had built something of genuine value, a nationally recognized brand, a specialty catalog with decades of customer loyalty, a product line anchored by one of the most beloved trainer designs in American RC history. GenCap saw a business. Martin saw 40 years. Those are not always the same thing, and the distance between them is where most founder exits go quietly wrong. The specific terms of the sale are not part of the public record. What is known is the moment itself. Jim Martin walked out of the Brentwood building he had constructed on cheap farmland in 1970, past the catalog operation he had run on $15 of profit and 5 years of unpaid faith, and handed the keys to people who had not grown up inside it. People who had not spent a winter building a Telemaster. People who had not taken calls from hobbyists in Montana, who needed a specific servo and had nowhere else to turn. This was not a crime. It was not even unusual. It was simply the moment when the thing that made Hobby Lobby International what it was, one man's obsessive, particular, pilot's eye understanding of what electric flight could be, left the building and did not come back. Private equity ownership is not inherently destructive, but it operates on a different clock than a founder does. Where a founder measures time in decades and products and customer relationships, private equity measures time in holding periods and exit multiples. The catalog could continue. The Telemaster could continue. The Brentwood address could continue. What could not continue, because it could not be transferred or quantified or put on a balance sheet, was the institutional soul of the place. That had walked out with Jim Martin on the day he signed the papers. The catalog kept going out. The orders kept coming in. From the outside, Hobby Lobby International in 2004 and 2005 looked much as it had looked in 1994. The name was the same, the products were recognizable, the Telemaster was still in the catalog, still being sold to men who wanted to learn to fly, or who had been flying one version of the design for 30 years. But longtime customers, the kind who had been ordering from the same company since the 1970s, who remembered when Jim Martin himself might answer a technical question, began to notice something harder to name. A change in the personality of the catalog, a shift in the depth of the product curation. The sense that the people on the other end of the phone line knew the inventory without knowing what the inventory meant. In 2009, GenCap sold Hobby Lobby International again. The new owner was Mark Cleveland, a Middle Tennessee entrepreneur who had grown up flying RC models in Oregon and had always wanted a hobby store of his own. Cleveland and his brother Kurt moved into the Brentwood operation with genuine enthusiasm. They were hobbyists. They understood the culture. In a different era, their arrival might have represented exactly the kind of re-energizing that a founder-less company needed. But 2009 was not a different era. By the time Cleveland took ownership, the company had passed through 2 ownership changes in 6 years. The RC hobby landscape had transformed almost beyond recognition. Chinese manufacturers were flooding the American market with ARF and RTF aircraft at price points that domestic catalog operations could not approach. Horizon Hobby had consolidated its position as the dominant force in American RC retail, online and off. The customer who might have spent an evening with the Hobby Lobby catalog in 1988, circling electric motors and glider kits, was now clicking through a website at midnight and receiving his order 4 days later. The Telemaster survived all of this, but in a form that told its own story about what had changed. The balsa kit that had defined the design for decades was increasingly giving way to the ARF version, pre-built, pre-covered, ready to install electronics and fly. The hands-on construction that had been inseparable from the Telemaster experience. The winter evenings at the workbench, the smell of balsa cement, the satisfaction of a wing built true from a flat plan, was being engineered out of the product in the name of accessibility. The Telemaster was still flying over American grass fields, but it was flying with less of itself intact. The men who had grown up on the catalog felt this, even if they could not always articulate it precisely. They kept ordering. They kept flying. But when they called Brentwood with a technical question, something in the exchange had changed. The answer was correct. The knowledge was adequate. But the conversation no longer felt like talking to someone who had been there from the beginning, because nobody there had been. Outside the Brentwood building, the broader RC hobby was moving at a speed that no catalog operation, under any ownership, could easily match. Quadcopters were arriving. FPV racing was taking shape in backyards and parking lots. The demographic that had built Telemaster trainers and flown them on Saturday mornings at the club field was aging out of active participation. The next generation of pilots did not know what a balsa kit was, and largely did not care. By the early 2010s, Hobby Lobby International was still operating, still selling, still sending out catalogs and filling orders from the Brentwood address. Mark Cleveland was running a legitimate business. The Telemaster was still in the lineup. The name was still on the building. And then, from 800 miles away, a Supreme Court case began rewriting the final chapter of a story that had started in a 600-square-foot room on Franklin Road in 1964. By the end of that year, the only question left was not whether Hobby Lobby International would survive. It was whether the name would. The case was called Burwell Verti Hobby Lobby Stores, Inc., and it had nothing to do with radio-controlled airplanes. It had nothing to do with balsa wood or electric motors, or a trainer design imported from Germany in 1973. It had nothing to do with a 600-square-foot store on Franklin Road, or a building on cheap farmland in Brentwood, or a catalog that had arrived in American mailboxes for 50 years. It was a case about the Affordable Care Act, about contraception mandates, about whether a privately held corporation could claim religious exemption from federal health care requirements. It was litigated in Washington, D.C., and argued before the 9 justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, and it generated the kind of national media coverage that attaches itself to a name and does not let go. The name it attached itself to was Hobby Lobby. Through 2013, as the case worked its way toward the Supreme Court, the words Hobby Lobby appeared in newspapers, on television, on radio, on the internet, millions of times. The Hobby Lobby that America was reading about was a chain of arts and crafts stores founded in Oklahoma City in 1972 by a man named David Green, a company that by 2013 operated more than 500 locations in 40 states and generated billions of dollars in annual revenue. It sold picture frames and yarn and seasonal decorations and artificial flowers. It had never sold a Telemaster. It had never mailed a catalog to a hobbyist in Montana. It shared nothing with the company in Brentwood, Tennessee, except 4 words and a historical coincidence. But 4 words are enough. In the American public mind, Hobby Lobby now meant one thing and one thing only, and it was not electric RC aviation. Mark Cleveland and his team in Brentwood watched this unfold with the particular helplessness of people who can see exactly what is happening and have no mechanism to stop it. Their phones were ringing with calls that had nothing to do with airplanes. Their email inquiries were coming from people who had confused them with a craft chain in a lawsuit. Customers who had been ordering from Hobby Lobby International for decades were finding the name suddenly weighted with associations that had nothing to do with the hobby they loved. New customers, the ones Cleveland needed to sustain the business going forward, were searching online and finding the Oklahoma craft chain before they ever found the Tennessee RC operation. The confusion was not temporary, it was structural, and it was only going to deepen when the Supreme Court issued its ruling. The decision came down in June 2014. Hobby Lobby Stores, Inc. won. The case became one of the most discussed Supreme Court decisions in years, a landmark ruling on religious freedom and corporate personhood that would be cited and debated for decades. The name Hobby Lobby was now embedded in American legal and cultural history in a way that no RC catalog could compete with, and no amount of marketing could dislodge. Cleveland had made the decision before the ruling came down. In December 2013, Hobby Lobby International announced it was changing its name. The new name was Hobby Express. The stated reason was to avoid confusion with the craft chain. The timing was framed publicly as a celebration. The company's 50th anniversary, a moment of transition and renewal. Mark Cleveland said the right things. He promised continuity. He promised that the products and the service and the commitment to the hobby would not change. What he could not promise was that 50 years of brand identity could be transferred to a new name by filing paperwork. The sign came down in Brentwood on a December day in 2013. The crew that removed it was not performing a ceremony. They were doing a job. The letters that had been on that building since Jim Martin constructed it in 1970, the name he had chosen because his first store sat in the lobby of his father-in-law's Five and Dime, came off the wall and went wherever old signs go. A new sign went up. Hobby Express, clean, inoffensive, carrying none of the weight of what it had replaced. Former employees and longtime customers processed the news online, in forums and comment sections, and a Facebook group called Hobby Lobby RC. The old days, where people who had worked in the Brentwood building or grown up ordering from the catalog gathered to share photographs and memories. The photographs showed the building in its working years, loading docks and catalog pages, and the particular organized chaos of a mail-order operation at full speed. The memories were specific in the way that only real experience produces. The smell of the warehouse, the sound of the phones, the weight of a season's worth of incoming orders, stacked and sorted and ready to ship. None of that had a place in the new name. 2 years later, in approximately 2015, the original Hobby Lobby building in Brentwood was demolished. The farmland that Jim Martin had purchased in 1970, cheap land on the edge of a quiet community that had since become one of the wealthiest suburbs in Tennessee, was worth considerably more than it had been when he broke ground. The building came down without ceremony, as the sign had come down without ceremony, as the name had changed without ceremony. The telemaster continued. Hobby Express still sold it, still supported it, still put it in the hands of pilots who wanted a stable, honest trainer with 50 years of proven performance behind it. The design was more durable than any of the ownership changes, more durable than the name change, more durable than the building that had originally housed the company that brought it to America. A good aircraft design does not care who owns the catalog. But Hobby Lobby International, the specific thing that Jim Martin had built from $15 and a pilot's faith in electric flight, was gone. It had not crashed. It had not burned. It had been renamed by the gravitational pull of a Supreme Court case about contraception mandates, 800 miles away, involving a company that had never once looked at the sky. The gates did not close with a ceremony. The website stayed up. The telemasters still flew. But the name was gone. And with the name went the last traceable thread connecting a 600-square-foot store on Franklin Road in 1964 to the 50 years of American flight culture it had quietly, stubbornly, without sufficient recognition, helped to build. Franklin Road in Nashville is not what it was in 1964. The strip where Jim Martin opened his dime store is developed now. Chain restaurants, nail salons, the particular commercial texture of a southern city that has grown faster than its own memory. The spot where a 600-square-foot hobby shop once stood across from a Five and Dime, where a former Air Force pilot spent 5 years without a salary, building something he could not yet prove deserved to exist. There is no marker there, no plaque, no sign indicating that the electric RC revolution in the United States has an origin point somewhere in this block. The city did not think to remember it. Cities rarely do. In Brentwood, the farmland that Martin purchased in 1970, is worth more than he could have imagined when he broke ground on a building meant to house catalogs and inventory and the particular organized energy of a mail-order operation finding its stride. The building itself is gone, demolished around 2015, quietly, without announcement. What replaced it, or failed to replace it, is the kind of development that fills suburban Tennessee now. The land has moved on. The land does not remember what was built on it. Hobby Express still operates out of Brentwood. The website is functional. The telemaster is still in the lineup. Laser cut now, more precise than the hand-cut balsa kits of the 1970s. Available in ARF format for pilots who want to fly without building. The ERC motor line continues. The catalog, in its digital form, still exists. Mark Cleveland's company is a going concern, smaller than what preceded it. serving a hobby community that is itself smaller and older than it was at the peak of the Brentwood operation's influence. But walk through the Hobby Express website looking for the soul of what Jim Martin built, and you will not find it. Not because Cleveland's team is doing anything wrong, but because that soul was never a product. It was a sensibility. It was the specific knowledge of a man who had flown tankers for the Air Force and spent 5 unpaid years learning what electric flight could become, expressed through hundreds of catalog pages and thousands of product decisions made by someone who actually understood what he was selling. That cannot be preserved in a website. It can barely be described in words. The 1986 Hobby Lobby International Catalog, thick, printed in color, dense with the particular optimism of a specialty retailer at the height of its confidence, appears occasionally on eBay. Sellers describe it as very rare. Bidders who remember waiting for it in the mailbox know exactly what they are looking at. They are not buying a catalog. They are buying a winter evening from 40 years ago, a kitchen table and a red pen, and the specific anticipation of deciding which item to save up for first. That feeling has no current equivalent. The internet does not produce it. A website does not arrive in the mailbox. On a Facebook page called Hobby Lobby RC, The Old Days, former employees post photographs of the Brentwood building in its working years, loading docks, catalog pages laid out for printing, the warehouse in full operation, boxes stacked and addressed and ready for the truck. The comments beneath the photographs are written by people who know exactly which corner of which room they are looking at, who remember the sound the phones made during the busy season, who can name colleagues from 30 years ago by their position in a group photo. The trademark complaint that eventually threatened the page, filed almost certainly by someone associated with the Oklahoma craft chain, did not succeed in erasing the memories. It only confirmed the particular cruelty of what had happened to the name. Jim Martin's legacy in the American RC community is not in dispute among the people who know it. The electric flight culture that defines a significant portion of modern RC aviation, the quiet motors, the lithium batteries, the sailplanes thermaling over grass fields on summer afternoons, traces a direct line back to one man who went to Europe in 1967 and came home with a conviction that nobody else in America yet shared. He was right before the market was ready. He built the infrastructure for a revolution that eventually outgrew the company that started it. That is not a failure. That is the particular bittersweet fate of pioneers, to be most responsible for a world they are least able to control. The hobby landscape he helped create is unrecognizable now. Quadcopters, FPV racing, drone delivery, aircraft that require no pilot skill whatsoever, that stabilize themselves by algorithm, that can be unboxed and flown by a child in 20 minutes. The men who built Telemaster trainers from balsa kits on winter workbenches are in their 60s and 70s. The flying fields where they learned are quieter than they used to be. The hobby has not died, but it has transformed into something that the 1986 Hobby Lobby catalog could not have anticipated and would not entirely recognize. Somewhere over a grass field in Middle America, a Telemaster is still flying. It moves the way Jim Martin's design always moved. Slowly, steadily, with a patience that modern aircraft do not bother to imitate. Wide turns, a gentle climb, the particular grace of an aircraft that was designed to forgive mistakes and reward attention. The pilot on the ground has his transmitter up and his eyes on the wing. He may not know who brought that design to America. He may not know about a 600-square-foot store on Franklin Road or a $15 profit, or a sign that came down in Brentwood on a December afternoon in 2013. The plane doesn't know either. It just flies. It always just flew.